Hello all, welcome to Active Humber's Autumn Conference. Conference should have been in March, but for obvious reasons that was postponed until now. It's fantastic to see so many people live with us today, especially at this time, and what a time it's been. It's fantastic though to see that in times of uncertainty, we've had some great support. Lots of people out there have been doing so much great stuff, providing opportunities for the communities, taking on new roles, providing new opportunities and getting to grips with a new virtual world. And I have to say how impressed I've been with the whole sector responding to the current crisis. On the virtual world, obviously this conference is being held virtually. We're not going to keep people for too long, and do feel free to stand up and maybe go for a walk around afterwards so that we're not enabling that sedentary behaviour from people. This session is virtual. There will be some pauses in between speakers. There'll be some holding music and a holding screen as well, just while we make sure that the cameras and microphones and what have you are working, and we pass over to the different speakers this morning. So please don't go anywhere. It's not a technical issue. It's just as we make sure that things are right for everybody and everybody can hear what is going on. We're fortunate that we've got Tim Hollingsworth, Chief Executive of Sport England, joining us this morning. And as you'll all be aware, it's great to have somebody such as Tim with us today, but he also has been pulled into some conversations this morning with ministers, hence the reason why the conference has been slightly delayed this morning. There will be an opportunity still for question and answers, and we do want to hear your questions today to put forward to both Tim and David this morning. You don't have to wait until the question and answer session starts. Please do, as you're listening into what's been said this morning, drop them into the chat and we'll see them coming up. For ease, I will be selecting the questions that we'll put forward to Tim and David. We'll hopefully get through as many of those as possible. Obviously, we might not be able to get through all of them, but we'll give it a good try. Just on, lastly from me, obviously we can't replicate a physical conference where we would have normal networking and coffee breaks and give you all the chance to talk to each other. But we have tried to replicate that where we can. So for those of you that registered early and registered for our free gift, you will have hopefully received that in the post. So you'll have a fairly healthy snack in a small bag of popcorn. You'll have a taste of Yorkshire in a Yorkshire tea. And also a bag of bulbs, which are for you to do a little bit of physical activity, get outside, get into the outdoors, plant the bulbs and watch them grow. And also it means that every time you see those, you'll obviously be thinking of Active Humber as well. And we do want you this morning to share with us your thoughts about the conference. Use the hashtag Active Humber Conference and tag Active Humber into all your social medias. And also, as you watch the bulbs grow that we've provided as well, as you get those first green shoots and as they blossom into full bloom, we would love for you to share those photos and thoughts with us as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to David Gent, who's the Chief Executive of Active Humber.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the conference this morning. Before we talk with Tim, I'm going to talk through our priorities through to summer next year. Obviously, the pandemic is going to be all dominant during that period, and we want to play our part is how best we can get people being physically active and get back to whatever the new world will be like. So next week, we're going to be sending to you all and to all of our partners a document called Forward in Motion. This is our response about how we would like to work with you as we move through the pandemic and help hopefully get more people physically active and help those most in need. It's going to focus around 6 areas, and I'll leave that for when you get the document. But the important thing I want to stress today is we see this as a partnership about how we can best work together to deal with the pandemic and move to a better place where more and more people are being physically active. The second area that we really want to concentrate over the next 6 months is we would like to recruit a couple of more board members to the Active Humber board. We've currently got 8 board members, and we would really like to get to 50-50 in terms of gender on the board. We've already got 3 women and 5 men, so we're looking for a couple of extra board people, but also particularly from those communities, whether it be people working in the world of disability, long-term health conditions, or Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities, to really give an extra skill set and an extra understanding into what is already a really good board, but we want to make it stronger and better so we can put ourselves in the best possible position for how we move forward. The third area over this period is to really concentrate and better understand our role and our contribution to climate change. The Humber is absolutely leading the United Kingdom in the technologies and the approach to this whole area of work. And I believe, and the board of Active Humber believes, that we need to be very much showing our role and our place of physical activity in that. We absolutely know that sedentary behaviours are incredibly carbon intensive behaviours. So if we can get the most inactive active, that will be a great contribution towards helping the Humber move towards being climate neutral and carbon zero. But as we all know, it's a tremendous task getting the most physically inactive active, but it's a well worth task. And certainly at the Waterline Summit a couple of weeks ago, there was a real recognition of the role that physical activity can play in the region to help us get to that carbon neutral future. So we want to work with you very much on that carbon neutral agenda. The fourth area that we really want to spend more time on and more focus on is inequalities. We've done really well through the Sport England Community Emergency Fund and through the Tackling Inequalities Fund to get the money that's needed at this time into those communities and those localities facing the greatest inequalities at this time. And that I applaud everyone for their outstanding efforts on doing that. But we simply need to do more. We know that the pandemic is affecting those facing the greatest inequalities more than others. And we know that those who are least active are usually those facing the greatest inequalities. Our participation rates are still amongst the lowest in England. And whilst we've had a great set of active lives results recently where all of our 4 areas have gone up, we've still got so far to go on this. So again, we want to redouble our efforts, work better with you at a local community level to tackle those inequalities and find new solutions to how we can get more people involved and engaged. The fifth area is around children and young people. Now, Sport England have been really good to all of the active partnerships across the country in that they've released and flexed up the requirements around the funding that they give each active partnership. So we have a unique opportunity to better plan and better work how that money could best be deployed to get this generation facing the pandemic to be more active. Now, my colleagues Gary, Joe and Sarah have been talking with the PDMs across the Humber, and we really want to come up with a really good quality solution to get this generation physically active, and not that the pandemic was something that caused a long-term drop down in physical activity rates. But we can't do that by ourselves. It's going to be a multi-organisational, multi-community approach. So we really need your help again on that to get this generation more physically active. And the final area that we want to concentrate through to the summer next year is that about this time next year, we at Active Humber will be applying to Sport England for our next 4 years funding. But that's not about that. The new framework that Tim will talk about shortly, and then we'll question on it, gives a fantastic opportunity for the Humber to sort out some of those problems that have been hanging around for a long period of time. But we can't just simply go in with a very simplistic, give us more money. We need to tell a story and present a plan that is engaging, that is innovative and really is about making a difference and breaking down those inequalities and showing that there's a unique way here in the Humber that we can make our contribution to raising participation rates. That's going to cause all of us to have new thinkings and new ways of doing that. We need to be up for that because we can't simply do what we've always done. That's what's keeping us in the worst of the activity rates across England. We need to find over this next 9-month period something really good that we can put forward and therefore build our long-term partnership, not just with Sport England, but with other national and regional funders, that they really want to invest in the Humber for the better of the future. So quickly, just to go back over those 6 things before we hand over and talk with Tim. The first is that we will circulate this forward in motion paper. It's about how we all work together to work on the pandemic. Secondly, we're looking for a couple more board members. We'd really like your help on that. Thirdly, responding to climate change and putting the Humber at the very front of thinking around physical activity and climate change. Fourthly, absolutely everything should be permeating with our inequalities at work and really making this the place where it's as best as we possibly can. Children and young people will remain upfront and central to all of we do. And then finally, working with Sport England and others to get the best possible future that we can by working in partnership. So that's for me now. Please put your questions and answers in. We're going to have a little short break and then I'll be back with Tim Hollingsworth. Thank you. Well, hello, Tim, and welcome from the Humber.
The angle on my thing, it's not quite right, is it? Never mind, I have to work it out. Hi, nice to see you. I saw you just caught the last couple of minutes of your discussion there, so that's good. How can I do that? There we are. That's more central, isn't it? Hi. Yeah, no, I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm sorry for the slight messing around, but hopefully it hasn't made things too difficult, David.
No, it's absolutely all right. I mean, we are in unusual times, and that's one of the things we want to talk about today, about how we best cope in this time and get forward into the future. So if you could sort of give us a few of your thoughts about where you think the Sport England new framework's going to go, and then after that, I'll ask you a few questions. So over to you, Tim.
Are we on now, live? Yeah,
we're on now. Yeah.
Oh, right. Well, we're back. Great. Good morning. Sorry, I didn't realise that was that. I'm glad I didn't say anything incriminating. Therefore,
you didn't.
And obviously, my concern about my picture gives away the vanity of being on these different calls. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. And I'm going to start with sort of 2 apologies and thank you. The 2 apologies. One, I know the timing slightly messed around this morning and had to accommodate me coming in slightly later, as is the way of desire for me to join in a conversation within the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. I start my day with a diary that looks like it's the thing I'm going to pursue, and then I have to find the ways to engage with DCMS at late notice, but it is very relevant to everything that we're speaking about today. And indeed, as I will sort of chat further, at least within our sponsor department and the department's relationship with our sector, the conversation is very aligned and positive in these very, very challenging times. My second apology is that, not that I could do anything about it, but I'm really sorry I'm not actually with you. The original plan when this conference was first scheduled was, of course, for me to join you in Hull and Humber, and then obviously, as I'm doing virtually later, to go on to our local delivery pilot in Withensea. For me, it's a real point. It's nearly 2 years since I joined Sport England. I've managed to, prior to the pandemic, really make an effort to not only get to all our local delivery pilots, but to make sure that a large part of my job was spent with the various regions, with the active partners, making sure that I saw the work on the ground and heard from people who are actually delivering in place. Clearly, that's been rather stymied in the last 6 months, although we're all getting much better at this process. The thank you is to everyone involved today for you joining and particularly also to our partnership with Active Humber. I know there's been quite a lot of change over the last few years. I think that's certainly one that we would want to recognise and welcome. And for me, as Chief Executive, to talk very positively about that and the relationship that we think is coming forward. And indeed, in these last period, the Community Emergency Fund, the Tackling Inequalities Fund, some of the ways we've tried nationally to ensure that we support the sector in this incredibly difficult time. It's relied very much on the regional and local knowledge and expertise of partners, and Active Humber have done a great job around that. So thank you. And David, I'm glad you got the white shirt, dark suit memo this morning as well. We're feeling vaguely formal about this morning, both of us. But let me. I mean, it's always good to joke, and it's always good to make light of circumstances. But these are not easy times. They're very, very tricky, challenging times for all of us personally, with our families, with our way of life, and then, of course, for all of us that care deeply about the nation's activity levels and about sport and its role in society and how it can impact positively both our individual health and well-being and our sense of community. And that's absolutely where I think I should spend my brief time with you before we get on to questions, is really talking about how we see that now, but more actually how we see that playing out in the emerging strategy. To be clear, and I think I'll sort of come back to this point, we do know that creating a strategy for the next decade, which is our intention, is both might seem, if we positioned it wrongly, as being rather tin-eared to the current world. How can we be looking ahead to a world of the next decade when so many people can find it very difficult even to look ahead to the next week? But that makes it even more relevant in many ways, because it's about channeling and positioning what we see as being important, what we see as being as mattering in this environment, and making sure that everything that we do relates to our collective response to the COVID pandemic. It's also important, I think, to reflect on the fact that while the recent Active Lives survey that we had out was a bit historic, it did capture the first 8 weeks of the pandemic. It pointed to the fact that prior to all of this, and I know that the storms that we had in the early part of this year before the pandemic hit also impacted for many of you. But prior to the pandemic, we were showing record levels of activity across the nation. We were doing a job collectively of embedding sport and physical activity more effectively in people's lives. Within that, and this becomes a crucial point for the strategy, we were still seeing those stubborn inequalities, as we like to call them, about the way in which that was being done and who was being able to access it. And I think that none of that has changed. What we have seen, of course, is the decline in activity over the period that has become more sustained, and the slight misconception perhaps that while it was brilliant in the early stages of the pandemic, that we did, through encouraging people to go outside, and we should pay credit to the government for that, they did in the early stages allow for outdoor exercise as one of the 4 reasons to leave your home, where many other nations, particularly in Western Europe, didn't do that. But nonetheless, as we've seen the sustained reduction in and restriction to community sport and opportunities for activity, even before we're going into this current period that started yesterday, the numbers are clearly worrying for us all. So we've got to do everything we can do, not only to sustain the sector, but also to think about ways to maintain and enhance the opportunity for people to realise the significance of activity in their life, and then find ways for that to be possible. And I think alongside that, we've clearly highlighted the importance in our role as Sport England in helping to support you to do that, and to support our active partnerships to engage in that agenda. Hence, for example, the early stage community emergency fund, where we put up to 35 million in to enable clubs up and down the country to see through that very difficult early period. Pursued that with a Tackling Inequalities fund, which was generally recognising that money wouldn't necessarily reach those most in need, and therefore we needed to work with more expert partners to deliver against that. And now the more recently opened Return to Play fund, which is a current open fund in Sport England for both revenue grants and capital, which can enable organisations who are looking ahead to when we hope to go back at least to the tiered restrictions that were in place previously, to enabling facilities, to enabling clubs, to enabling community groups and organisations to have some of the wherewithal that's needed to just be. So a lot of work going on in that COVID response. But it is also in parallel, as I say, a chance to finalise a strategy that would build on our previous current strategy towards an active nation, about which many of you, I think, will be very familiar, and to learn some of the lessons that we've had come to the fore in that strategy period, not least from the local delivery pilots. I think it's been generally a significant shift for Sport England. The strategy, it built on the 5 outcomes that government identified for its investment in sport: the social outcomes of physical well-being, mental health and well-being, individual development and confidence, stronger communities and social integration, and ultimately some economic benefit to the nation. And I think it's really important that we don't suggest there's going to be a radical shift away from that focus, because there won't be. We're not really on a revolution of the what in this strategy. It's much more an evolution of the what, taking what we've learned, recognizing where we can make a difference and the key areas of focus. But the revolution really is in the how we work, what we seek to do from Sport England's perspective, how we see our role, how we see the role, therefore, of partnership, how we can consider the role of our resource, not just in making sure that programs happen, but also the capacity that's often needed to build and sustain effective partnerships. So all of that is part of our thinking now, that revolution of the how. And I think when we finally publish our strategy, you'll see as much in that belief in what's needed and how we should work together as there is about a radical shift away from the areas of focus that we've had for some time. And the sort of shining light through it all, or the lens through which all of this will be refracted, is tackling inequalities. It's been the guiding principle of the strategy feedback that we've had so far in the consultation. And we've tried to enact the consultation in a way, today's a bit of this actually, trying to enact the consultation in a way that fits how we want to deliver the strategy, not to be transactional about it, where we're going to send out a consultation document, ask for people to give multiple choice responses, and then collate all of that and then tell you what we're going to do. Rather, we've really sought to work with our partners, old and new, to find ways to engage in that people can feel generally collaborative around its formation. And therefore, we can be much more confident that the themes that emerge align with what you're seeing, what you're feeling on the ground, and what we collectively believe is important and necessary now. And tackling inequalities is the single biggest focus of that. We know that we need to have a universal offer. We know that we need a nation as a whole to be active and enjoy playing sport. But we do know that the system as it stands does not provide equally for everyone to access that, and that there are factors that we can overcome if we give sustained attention to them, that need to change to enable more people to feel the benefit. So that shining light, if you like, on the whole thing of tackling inequalities is one I'm sure we'll come back to. And I think particularly, and I'm very consciously talking to you from the other end of the country. I live in the West Country, down in Bath, and it's a very easy thing for me to do, to talk about tackling inequalities when I'm sitting in my spare bedroom. But actually, what we know very much is what's going on the ground, what people are realizing and feeling and responding to now, that will help shape the thinking in a major way. The only bit that really I'd like to leave with you now, before we go on to questions and the conversation, is therefore what our key areas of focus are going to be. And they were sort of indicated in the framework document that we put out earlier this year in May, but they're really hardening now around 5 key themes that I think we can see really necessary and important for our future strategy. The first of those, in my mind, is understanding the context of the world in which we're living now. So a key area of focus for us would be, and we're not quite finalised on the words for this because we're desperately keen not to call it Build Back Better, but to actually understand the opportunity that there is in relation to our support now for those organisations and for the ambitions that we all share to still look to recover and reinvent in a way that, uses this dreadful period to make sure we don't just survive, but thrive into the future when we see a more permanent recovery. So that ecosystem of organizations of people that support millions of people to stay active, that's our focus in terms of now, the next year, the next coming years, that recovery and reinvention of what we know needs to be sustained, but also how we can perhaps make it different. And I'll be really interested in hearing today on where the challenges of now have created innovation that can actually do things differently. It might even be something really basic and simple, like it's very easy for me to join you today and speak for half an hour because we've all got very used to this way of working. I don't think it'll be a substitute for a real life visit, but nonetheless, it's one very, very small example. In a governing body context, I heard yesterday from a chair of a governing body who used to hold their AGMs, in a wet Tuesday night in March in a hall somewhere where they'd get 10, 20 people turn up. They had their AGM online a couple of weeks ago and had nearly 500. So there are ways in which you can engage differently and work differently as a result of this, but that's only a tip of the iceberg in my view. The real innovation will come from what it's forced in terms of how people are thinking and working and behaving differently. But that recovery and reinvention is a major, major key area of focus for the strategy. A second one is the absolute unashamed belief that we should be better aligned as a sector with public health and active and healthy lives. I think that connection is crucial. I know it's a big part of my day to day. I know it's a big part too of the conversation that we're having. But to make sure that at national and local level, we have more alignment, more connectivity with public health, whether that's through primary healthcare, social prescribing, or generally the interaction with the public health agenda. It was welcome to see physical activity as part of the recent government obesity campaign, but actually making it really critically part of the understanding of how we can be a better, more healthy, more active nation through being more active. Equally, and this is a big part, and our Secretary of State, Oliver Dowden at the DCMS, has written in the Daily Telegraph an article today about school sport. I think building an active habit for life in our children and young people, building those strong foundations is the third critical focus for us. We need to make sure that next generation have that sense of embedded belief in sport and its power and being active through the rest of their lives. And I do absolutely believe that comes with an understanding of what physical literacy is and means. And we will be putting a lot of focus there, particularly in terms of the enjoyment factor and making sure that our young people don't feel turned off by the experience they have either in school or out of school at a young age. The fourth area is one that I think will play particularly to our conversation, not least because of the way that we can see some of the work that we're doing in partnership with you at Active Humber and indeed around the area, not least with the local delivery pilot. It's a sense of stronger communities. I personally believe in this enormously in terms of the consequential role that we can have and the role that Sport England can play. It's not just what we've learned about place-based working. It's not just what we've learned about through the local delivery pilots about how we can engage more effectively with communities. If you do work with that principle of asset-based community development, of working from the bottom up, of working with those who most understand the people we're trying to reach and support. It's actually deeper than that. It's that fundamental belief that sport and being active can be a really positive part of the fabric of the nation, that stronger communities can rely on the clubs and the people that serve them, and that actually we can also use sport and activity in a positive way to improve behaviour and create social change. There's an interesting report a couple of years ago from a lady called Dr. Rosie Meek, if some of you will know it, into looking at the impact of sport and physical activity on young offenders on remand and how much more positively they engaged with their circumstances when they were positively engaged in sporting activity. Building on that sort of agenda for our stronger communities, recognising that social integration and community development can be driven through our effective intervention is a really important part of where our strategy is headed. And then lastly, but this is something again you'll all reflect on and recognise, we'll be focused in on the active environment and actually recognising that the places and spaces where this happens, whether that's formally in pitches and facilities and sports halls and leisure centres, or the parks and the open spaces and the rivers and the coastal areas that we can use more effectively to drive activity, to support it, and to make sure that people, feel that it can be a safe environment for them and a positive environment for them to enjoy their activity. So those 5 key areas are really important. There will be, alongside that, a set of catalysts that we think are very important. So the governance and leadership agenda is one that we see as Sport England as being a key focus for our next strategy in the next decade. Are more generally the people in the workforce. I've long believed in my sort of conceptual idea of purpose, people and place when it comes to what we're collectively seeking to do. We need to have a common purpose about why all this matters. We need the right people there to support it, both professional and volunteer, to make it an inclusive, welcoming, positive experience. And we need a place that can make sense for people. The environment actually needs to suit them rather than us that we should determine where sport and activity has to happen. And I think that sense of people will be really important, as will our understanding of data, as will our understanding of our insight, and ultimately for Sport England as well, our way of investing and what we can do with our money, not only to pay for programs, but to support, to convene, to advocate, to champion, and to create that capacity in the system that's much needed. So I do hope that that's a useful summary, David, of where we're at and stimulating conversation. I just do want to raise one more point, which is that we are going to be doing a final month of consultation while we come to a conclusion. Pretty much drafted in our heads and our thinking, but we want to go out and test it one more time. So there will be an online platform open, I think next week actually, to enable everyone on this call and many of your colleagues, and please publicize it, to take part in the final stage where we'll be putting forward these key themes and not really sort of testing them for right or wrong. I think we're pretty confident about that. But as I hope to get from you today, insight into what it can actually mean and insight into actually how we can approach it and capture the sort of diversity of view and of thought that can really make this the powerful strategy that we hope it's going to be. And particularly through all of that, how can we help tackle the residual stubborn inequalities that exist and make sure that we all fundamentally believe in the power of sport and physical activity to transform people's lives for the better. So I hope that was a helpful insight and update. More than anything, I'm very conscious that in this environment, it's better to try and hear from you, hear from the questions that you have, and do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. That was really insightful. So I'm going to ask a few questions just whilst we collate the questions coming in from people watching in the webinar. So to start off, I want to sort of pick up on that point about inequalities. In the document I've seen is everybody needs something, but some people need more. Particularly, what do you think we should be doing locally? Because I'm clearly conscious, great words nationally, but it does come down to local action, doing things locally. So what are you really looking and encouraging us all to do around inequalities at that local level?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I sometimes worry in my role and with Sport England generally that we can still be absolutely wedded to concepts and not be able to deliver them directly, practically on the ground. By the way, I should apologise. My next door neighbour's chosen today to have his roof done, and I didn't know that was going to happen. But occasionally we may feel I'm not too far away from where somebody's drilling right now, so huge apologies for that. The conceptual idea of this actually is not new, and it's very much driving a lot of health policy, as many people will know. Professor Michael Marmot's concept of proportionate universalism, where you need to have a universal offer in healthcare. We have to have a healthy nation across the board. But in terms of resources and in terms of priority, it has to be realized that that is not an equal response. There has to be a proportionate view taken about where the areas of greatest need are at. And that really our sort of thinking around that phrase that you referenced in terms of everybody needs something, but some people need more. We need a universal approach to this. We need to make sure that everyone in the country thinks and feels that sport and activity can be for them. But we can particularly then think about it from a prioritized point of view as to where are the areas of greatest need. And that's where it comes in at a local level, David, because actually where that then takes us is to say, well, we don't know all the answers to that. We need to actually understand what those priority areas are, where they are, and how best we can help to support that. And a large part of that, from my point of view, is that sense of devolving the answer, having posed the national question. So, I think we've always been historically rather guilty of being sort of nationally transactional and believing that there was a single solution that then should be played out across the country. And I think the pilot, more than anything else, have taught us that locally driven solutions actually can be most sustainable and ultimately can be most embedded within the local areas themselves. So, for example, I know there's a lot of this going on with you in Humberside, the relationship with the health service and the relationship with public health, and how that can be embedded locally. Is our resource actually about creating a separate stream of funding for health interventions in Humberside, or is it actually better in supporting the capacity that enables you and others to then create those partnerships that then create solutions on the ground that's relevant to your local population? My view is it's the latter. And therefore, what we mean by that is we won't always be, it will mean that our focus and our lens for our investment is more geared towards areas of greatest need. In our funds now, not least the Tackling Inequalities Fund, we've put an absolute focus on making sure that it is harder to reach areas, although I hate that phrase. And I was told very early on, actually, by a gentleman I met in Oldham, in one of the other pilot areas, that there's no such thing as a hard to reach community. It's just those that have been, previously unengaged. And so, recognizing that we can and should trust to those on the ground who have a better understanding of what that need is, rather than insisting that a national program has to be imposed. That's probably how we're going to make it live most effectively. The only other area thing that I would focus on and recognize is that it means those areas where there is stubborn inequality in the data. So are we going to prioritize investment in, for example, continuing to close the gender gap, in trying to improve the opportunity for disabled people to be active, in recognizing and then facing up to the challenge that we have historically around the involvement of ethnic minorities in sport and physical activity, and within that the complexity of then thinking that that's a single solution when in fact it's vastly different and quite complex problem depending on which area of the community you're talking about. And recognizing, and I know that this is a factor through the pilots in many ways, that it's social economic circumstance that's often one of the biggest factors to overcome. So yeah, the only other way that I would put it is place-based delivery, recognizing that we're not best placed necessarily naturally to understand what the solution should be, and then also reckon that every bit of the lens of our investment will be primarily into tackling those inequalities.
Well, that's great. And sort of the last question before we open it to everyone is, in the paper count, it was a great phrase, I thought, was stubborn on the vision, flexible on how we will get there. And particularly keen your thoughts about how we display that flexibility at a local level in the Humber, because we could fall back into our traditional behaviour. So your thoughts on that flexibility as we remain stubborn on the vision, but be flexible in our approach.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great phrase, and it works for Sport England as a sort of clarion call almost, because I think not just Sport England, but there's a history of government agencies being fairly stubborn on the vision and then incredibly stubborn on the details. And I think what we found, therefore, is that when things work well, they work well, but there's very often not ones that can then be scaled in any meaningful way, because suddenly you hit different circumstances in different parts of the country, or you hit different circumstances within different sports, or the attitude or the priorities of local authorities differ. So where we want to be flexible on the details is a bit what I've already been describing, which is that I think we have to understand that co-created solutions have to be produced in a different way, and we can't possibly own all co-created solutions, because that would just mean the equivalent of our having 12 local delivery pilots at the moment and suddenly trying to find a way of doing that across the country, which is both impossible from a resource point of view, for one. So the answer for you in your part of the world is, where we want that to happen is that we have a shared purpose and a shared vision for what we're trying to achieve, that we absolutely have bought in collectively to why it matters that we have a more active nation, to the role that sport can play in local communities, to the role that actually we can play with our young people in driving up public health, in creating the right environments where people can feel it's a safe and positive place for them to go. All of that should be the shared and completely stubborn vision for what we're trying to achieve and why it matters. And then after that, what will work to achieve that should be much more up to those in the local community. So part of our interpretation of it for you is we have to be honest about the fact that we need the partnership that I think is already developing well with the active partners, but with many other organizations as well, to be more collaborative. We need to understand that we have that shared purpose. And I don't see that necessarily as always being about devolving. I've had it described to me very well by somebody in the system that said that good collaboration is a contact sport. We need to be quite, tough about making sure that we are shared on the vision and that we have shared purpose. But once we're in that position, I would anticipate in this strategy for local delivery much more sense that you know what it is we're trying to achieve with our resource. You know what we're trying to achieve with our intention. And you in turn have the capacity, either as active Humber or the partners around you, to then engage in a way that will make most sense for your local population.
Well, really, thank you for that, Tim. Now, just hold on there. We're going to have, I think they'll say a commercial break, a little bit of a graphic, and then we're going to, hopefully, Gary will be joining us, and we'll have some questions from those watching in. So everyone just stay there for a moment, and we'll be back with you shortly for those questions. Hello, Gary.
Hello.
Hi, Gary.
Hi, Tim, and thank you for your thoughts this morning. It's been really interesting to listen to. So yeah, we've had a few questions come in, so thank you to everybody out there that has sent bits and pieces through. We've had a couple through on email as well. I think we'll start with, there's been a couple in around the children and young people side of things and around schools. So effectively the question is, how do we help schools to deliver upon kind of physical education, physical activity, and get the right mix of people in there? Specifically, there's been a notable increase of active learning taking place in education and teaching outside, obviously during this pandemic. How can we build on this as well after the pandemic?
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, I think what we've also sought to do with in-school sport, because I think one of the other bits of this strategy that we need to be clear about and then make sure we focus on is the relationship between the in-school sport and activity of our young people, and then that which they do in an extracurricular context. And obviously, from my perspective, one of the wrinkles in that is that it's the Department for Education who are responsible at a national level for in-school sport, and therefore we have to work in a different way at the moment to make sure that really does, effectively engage them against all the other challenges that they see. But the answer to the question is, I think, the provision of active learning and the provision of professional development for those in school who are responsible for sport physical activity is a critical part of it. We've invested from our own perspective, quite heavily in secondary teacher training to enable them to consider and understand better how to make it a more positive, inclusive experience, whilst not actually losing the potential for those for whom it is, progressional and have talent to still feel that that's open and available to them. And I think for all of you in your part of the world, it's understanding how best to access that within the sector, and also to make sure that we have a common understanding again of physical literacy at an early stage. So I think there's a silver bullet sort of route for me a bit with schools, and I'd be very interested in perspectives. I think we have investment going in still through the primary premium into primaries schools for activity, but it's very unstructured still. And I think asking collectively for that to have more focus, not around prescribing who should do it, but to have more focus around a physical literacy agenda, so that at a young age we are very much geared towards making it enjoyable and fun, and giving our young people the core skills to be active. Then in secondary level, I think absolutely it should be about more formalized activity. The role of team sports in schools is really, really important, but it should still be about the ability for that to be inclusive. And I think that that's where a lot of the active learning can take place, where it's about a skill set that's not taught in schools, in teacher training. I'm very conscious. My previous role to this one was at the British Paralympic Association, and I was very conscious how I think it might have been a 2-hour module that PE teachers had on disability inclusion, for example, and yet more and more in mainstream schools, you're getting disabled kids joining in with the sport activity. So focusing in on that as a way of trying to make it a more inclusive opportunity that doesn't disadvantage the non-disabled majority is one good example of where we can take active learning more directly. And then thirdly, and this applies nationally, but would be absolutely relevant to all your schools, the move to try and get Ofsted actually to measure and recognise the health and well-being of young people, or the sort of rounded school, or better still, the amount of and quality of sport and physical activity that goes on in secondary schools, I think would be a really positive force as well. And it's not impossible that that might be something on the agenda. But to the point about active learning, I think the more that we're able to support you in terms of the creation of that through DFE in schools, and when we haven't really touched on what can go on in an extracurricular capacity, but the out of school clubs, the development of the satellite clubs model, what can actually happen in that period during the week after schools have finished the sort of timetabled period. All of that, I think, is for me really important, and is a big focus for us in trying to get the DFE to understand the training and development need.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll move quickly on because there's a couple more that I'd like to get through in the time. So there's one from local authorities. Obviously, they've got a tough time at the minute with the pandemic, and there's a question that's come in around the public sector. What is Sport England doing to help local authorities with the government? And also, any thoughts on the status of the public sector relief fund for leisure centres?
Well, yeah, lots of thoughts on both of those, because it's a huge part of, it's a little bit of what I was talking about in the meeting just before. I mean, we absolutely recognise how significant in all parts of the country, but in some areas, how critical the publicly owned leisure sector is. The gyms, the pools, the sports centres on which so many people rely for their own activity, and on which so many sports clubs rely to be able to hold their activity. The situation at the moment is undoubtedly a critical one. There's so many local authorities, and we've heard from both the local authorities themselves, the relationship that we have with local government association and district councils and community leisure, and all those groups, UK Active as well, more from the operator point of view, just understanding that there is a real concern about the way that not only the last 6 months have impacted on that financial model, but how going forward the amount of restriction that's been in place and will continue to be in place. And we're not here today to second guess on all of that, but nonetheless, how critical that makes the situation. So we've talked, you asked, what are we doing with government? I hope it will feel to that sector and to the local authorities that we have, as Sport England, try to play our part in making sure that not just DCMS, but the other government departments, the Ministry for Housing and Local Government particularly, have understood just how important the role is of the leisure sector within our communities, and how fundamental it is that necessary it is that local authorities are supported to continue to allow them to exist. We were successful and have been successful in creating some headway in terms of funding and resource, and the support fund that was referenced. So there is 100 million between now and the end of March. But that will be available from early December, that has been made available by the Treasury for supporting local authorities directly to support their leisure centre. or centres and the operators. That is not, and please don't anyone on this call who's listening from areas, that is not going to be sufficient. And that's recognised by everybody. And we are continuing to push for more. But it is there, and it is there in the first tranche for the rest of this financial year to apply for and to help, hopefully, many operators and local authorities to continue to survive that part of their responsibilities. And our role in that now, and my colleagues in Sport England, some of them are on this full time, is to try and work out the best and most appropriate route for that funding to flow. And to the point I made about the strategy, it will inevitably, with it not being sufficient, make sure that it flows ideally to the areas of greatest need. We recognise that there will be some areas of the country where this is critical, and that money is needed to support the local authority sector in its leisure provision.
Good, thank you. I think we've probably got time for 2, maybe 3 more, and there's one that's coming from a health perspective. So what are your thoughts on the ways which we engage health partners given the importance of physical activity to prevent poor outcomes and promote recovery from COVID?
Well, this is one area where I think we can learn an enormous amount by hearing from rather than just talking to the health sector. And I know that's part of later on today for me, which I'm very much looking forward to. Those who are working clinically on the ground, the primary healthcare professionals, GPs, also, our relationship with, it's an existing relationship. It's going to become a new relationship with Public Health England, but the health promotion arm of Public Health England has been somewhere where we've been working for some time in partnership at the national level to try and create the agenda around the understanding of physical activity's ability to be a positive outcome for health, and especially around social prescribing. And that's one area. If people ask me what's an example of what I think we'll be giving increasing focus to, it will be undoubtedly on social prescribing and its potential as a route for activity and local community groups and clubs to be actively involved in people's mental health and physical health and well-being. And I think that relies on 3 things. I think it absolutely relies on the GPs themselves, primary healthcare, understanding and trusting more the principle of social prescribing, and that's in part their trusting of the solution of the outcome that's being suggested. Therefore, I think a key area for focus for Sport England and for all of us, including many of you on this call, should be then the provision of that opportunity. So whether that's an informal exercise group, or whether it's a sports club, it could well be, a walking football club or something that's been considered as being part of the social prescription. That has to be effective, that has to be available, that has to be easily understandable. So open data and allowing, GPs to find the answer quickly and easily in their local area. But then that leads me on to my third bit, which is that the role of the link worker in all of this will become ever more critical. And we, I think, collectively need to give probably as much focus as we need to healthcare professionals, to the link workers, for them to both understand and have confidence in their local area on what the offer could be. So I think social prescription is one of the key areas. Somebody said, what do you mean when you mean engage better with health? Of course, we want everyone to sort of instantly go to physical activity as part of their natural physical and mental well-being. Of course, we want it to be part of national campaigns and national agendas. But actually, if you want one answer to the question, what are we going to do differently? I think focusing more on social prescribing and those three bits of it, which is the ability of the GPs essentially to create demand, the ability of the link worker to take that demand and consider where it might best be suited, and then the supply side's ability to match up to that expectation and create something, whether formal or informal, that can work for the patient. That's one area where I can see us making a difference over the next decade that could be quite profound.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll do one more question. I'm just conscious of time. So this one links back into something that David was talking about as well in terms of board members and governance. So given the current challenges impacting availability on trustees and their time to support quality governance, What are your thoughts, and probably David, what are your thoughts on how we tackle this moving forward?
Well, I mentioned briefly that I think one of the sort of areas that we're highlighting and calling a catalyst for change in the strategy is to recognise collectively that the governance of the sport and ecosystem is a critical factor in that, and that there are two bits to it really. One is the welfare and safeguarding of everyone involved, and at a sport level, it's very easy to see. It's no surprise or it's pretty obvious to point out, the problem in gymnastics right now might, have a fundamental impact on whether or not parents in the future feel confident that they want their young people to try that sport. I sincerely and ultimately, passionately believe they should, but it's up to all of us to create an environment where that trust and that sense of welfare and safeguarding is in place. So that area of governance is critical. But there's also the successful stewarding of organisations at every level. And I think, we have created the Code for Sports Governance, and it's under current review precisely because we needed to set a template for what we thought good governance was. Initially, I think the code was seen as being something that was quite prescriptive and almost like a tick box exercise in order to qualify for public money. But I think it's turning itself into what it needs to be, which is the guide to all organisations in our sector as to what good governance looks like and why it matters. And I think it's going to be really important that we do more than just insist on, as you mentioned, trustees, a diversity, and insist on, the ability to be representative of different parts of the community, and insistence on time served and, independence and all the factors that are very, very relevant and important. We also need to support that. So at every level, but particularly for organisations, who've come to sort of prominence as national partners for Sport England, of which, Active Partnerships and Active Humber will be one, to make sure that we're also supporting that in terms of making the pipeline of potential trustees more available. I'm very proud of a piece of work we've done with a recruitment company, Perrott Laver, where, in recognising against the first governance code, there wasn't actually a high level of obviously available candidates, whether that was women or whether that was people from different ethnic backgrounds, and actually positively engaging in that agenda has created a long list of supremely talented and qualifiable candidates for trustees. And I think that more work around the sector and thinking about how can we take the positives of good governance and make it seem like a virtue rather than historically what it's perhaps felt like, which is a bit of an imposition or an administrative burden on organisations that are trying to do good work. I genuinely believe in governance as being the route to successful positive outcomes, not an administrative burden trying to get in the way.
Brilliant, thank you. And David, I don't know whether you've got anything to add from a local point of view on the governance issue.
Well, just to say, all of the evidence points that when we are inclusive in the truest sense of the word, we get better decision making, we get better approaches, we just get a better society. And I think it's beholden on all of us, and particularly people like me who've been in this sector for some time, that now is the time to be ever more inclusive than we've ever been. We will just be better. And all of the evidence shows that, and by being inclusive and being in that way and genuinely, I remember the old GB Sports Council, the phrase "sport for all." It went there, but essentially that's what we're at, and I think we've got so much more to do. But I agree with Tim. This is not an onerous thing to do. If we genuinely believe in an equal and an equitable society, then the fact of the matter is we must do much more, and we'll be so much better because we are inclusive.
Brilliant, thank you. And at that point, I think we will draw the question and answer session to the close. Apologies if we haven't got through all of the questions. There will be just a quick pause whilst the cameras are sorted out. Please don't go anywhere. Hello, thank you all for joining us today. We've heard quite a lot of information there from Tim and David, and I would firstly like to thank Tim for spending some time with us. Normally at this point there'd be a little ripple of applause, which I'm sure is taking place, but I can't quite hear it with it being virtual. So please do accept our appreciation, Tim. I think we've heard a lot there from David and Tim, like I said, and I think looking forwards, there's a couple of things that will be coming out in the short term, but also the long term. And I think from hearing everything that we've heard today, there's certainly a role for us all, everybody on this call, to play in that as well. So just to recap, there is the forward in motion document that you will receive soon from Active Humber, and we do look forward to hearing your thoughts on the 6 priorities that will be mentioned and the approach that we take on those. We've got the Sport England strategy, and it's great to see that that's taken that long-term look at things. And obviously there is the consultation that Tim mentioned, as well as that final sweep to look over it all and consult with people. And it's great that listening part of, as Tim suggested, that actually we want to hear from people on the ground. We want to hear people that are delivering. So please do engage with the consultation when that comes out. And I'm sure at Active Humber we will make sure that that is promoted to everybody on this call and further afield as well. So in 2021, we do hope to have our conference back as usual, and hopefully that will be a face-to-face meeting. And hopefully we'll be able to welcome Tim up to the Humber physically at some point as well in the near future. Lastly, on behalf of Active Humber, I would just like to say thank you for your time this morning, for listening and contributing. We've had some great questions in. I hope people have had a nice cup of tea and had a little bit of a snack as they've gone through that. And please do share the photos of the physical activity and the bulbs being planted. We hope to work with you all in the future moving forward, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Thank you for joining us.